Hello, everyone. Welcome back to part two of political organization. And you'll remember last time we were talking about services, last name of the anthropology services, way of dividing up political organization into bands, tribes, chiefdoms, and states. And last time we got through bands, tribes, and chiefdoms. Today we will pick up with states. We're going to talk about that, and then we're also going to talk about means of social control. Super, super important, whether you're in a band, tribe, chiefdom, or state. As you see here, you're probably already started writing all this down, right? You guys are so good. All right, so as you see here, we are going to talk about states. Again, no type of judgment here when we're talking about something that's more complex. It doesn't necessarily mean better, but states definitely have a greater level of complexity to them. Not that they're more evolved. There's just, as you know, because you live in a state, there's just a lot more going on in a state. And you think about for instance, saying something like red tape, right? You're trying to get something done, and they're like, "Oh no, you need to go talk over here and over there and over there, and you got to get this form signed, and you got to do this, and you've got to do that." DMV, a great example, right, of the complexity. See, not necessarily better. Okay, if any of you have spent time in the DMV, you're very familiar with that. So, a state is going to govern many communities over a broad geographic range. And we'll see that we are definitely looking at some high population densities here, between 10,000 to millions and millions and millions of people. Very large urban centers. And of course, in order to have the large urban centers, there's going to definitely be, kind of an urban versus a rural. You've got intensified agriculture. That is going to be able to feed all of these people. And we're going to actually come back to this idea when we think about initially states being formed, agriculture playing a pretty large role in that, depending on whose hypothesis you're looking at. So, to be continued on that. A little bit more here then to say about states, and that is that, make sure I click on that. There we go. Food surpluses are not equally distributed amongst individuals. And you're all familiar with this, right? As you know, you live in a stratified society. We talked about the fact that that stratified society could be a caste society or it could be a class society. Those exist in states. Um, there's a lot of inequality when it comes to states. We see some other things here. April 15th just passed, and states have the power to collect taxes. Oh, tax day. Although very different, I think, this year, right? In order to collect taxes, because taxes, of course, is going to be the large part of the revenue that is generated in order for the state to be able to run. You need to have a system of writing. You have to be able to record information about individuals. You have to have a system where you are keeping records. You need to have a way to weigh something, to measure something, because if you are going to, have taxation based on, let's say, number of dollars, that's your income, you have to have a system of weights and measurements. If you are going to tax someone according to how much of a particular type of agriculture they were able to produce, you need to be able to weigh that or estimate that and then have them pay taxes based on that. States, we saw this with chiefdoms though, but states also have the ability, and this is one of the benefits of living in a state, right? They have the ability to recruit labor for armies and civilian public works projects. A bridge needs to get fixed, a trail needs to be maintained, a sewer system, a water system, right? All of that are examples of civilian public works projects. And states, we of course benefit from that. So there's definitely labor specialization. You already knew that when we were talking about definitely having some intensified agriculture is going to free up a pretty good segment of the population from having to produce food to having a different trade skill that they're going to use. It doesn't free them up from having to get the food, right? Of course, from using that trade skill to be able to generate revenue for themselves and income so that they can go ahead and get the food. States, as you know, also have a monopoly on the right to use force. Depending on what we're talking about, if we're talking about something that's local, right, there will be a police force. And we were talking about this too with our example of, your neighbor keeps playing their music super loud and it could escalate to the point where you have to call the police, right? But again, it's a way that you know that if you go over there and try and arrest this person and throw them in your closet and you call it jail, you're going to get in trouble for that, right? Okay, because the police who are representing the state or the military who is representing the state, they're the ones that have the monopoly on the right to use force. So basically, as members of the state, we know that some of that force, right, our right to use force, except in some circumstances, is not under our purview anymore, right? We're like, we kind of relinquish that and a lot of the baggage that could come along with that. We relinquish that so that the state has the right to do that. Written laws, of course, are going to say, when one can use force, when they can't. If they do, what are some of the punishments that might happen? And as we all know, there's ideas of membership in a state, right? There weren't these ideas of membership in a band. You just were simply in a group, 50 people, you decided, ooh, too many, it's getting too crowded here. I don't have any elbow room. I'm going to go ahead and move to another location or there isn't enough food available. So, we talk about our membership. We have things like obviously our birth certificate that talks about, where we were born, that type of thing. On our driver's license, of course, we've got our forms of identification that give our citizenship on things like passports, right? All of those red tape, right? That the pieces of paperwork that follow us around because we are members of a state. You wouldn't go, for instance, and introduce yourself as, "Hi, I'm Lisa Mifsud from the Mifsud kin, and we hail from this mountain over there, and this is our family crest, and here's what we." I mean, eventually maybe you might talk to someone about your kind of your history and that type of thing, your ancestry, but it's not the way that you would initially identify yourself. And if I went on for too long, most of you would be like, "Oh, has she had enough coffee today?" Don't worry, I've had it. It's the afternoon. I've had enough coffee. But in a band, in a tribe, kinship and identifying yourself through those kinship relationships would be extremely important. We talked about the Chippewa Ojibwa, right? Actually, one of the first things that someone will talk about when they're introducing themselves to another member of the culture, but someone who's a stranger, they will ask them essentially, "What is your clan?" Because that tells them right away their relationship to those individuals. And that's not really how we would start our conversations with strangers in a state. You'd be like, "Where were you born?" Right? Or, you're going through security or something like that. You don't strike up a conversation with, "I hail from the mountains over there." You're going to end up not making it where you were hoping to go, right? They're like, "We're going to have to detain you." Again, state's the representative of the state is the one that has the right to use force. Okay, states are going to do some interesting things too. Maybe there are even things that as members of a state we kind of take for granted. So, states are going to incorporate monumental architecture. And okay, some of the monumental architecture could be something that's artistic. It's pleasing. It's aesthetically pleasing to the eye, right? And you look at it. Um, as we know, in some of these public places recently, the monumental architecture, because of what it stands for, because the state is talking about the ideology and what that represents, some of that is an aspect of our history in the United States that we're not proud of and was a very, bad and trying time in our country. And many are like, that whole depiction there of slavery and the Civil War and all of that, I'm not okay with that. And that represents that ideology. If any of you were either around old enough, I should say, I guess, in 2003, um, if you were watching television then, you were seeing the toppling of this portrait, this sculpture, right, of Saddam Hussein. You couldn't get away from it. Like the news cycle, they just kept playing it and playing it and playing it, right? And it was the representation, right, of the fact that he was gone. We had won and that the war was going to end. Well, we all know that that took some time, but it was that ideology and what that represented, right? And so while some of these objects, these sculptures, might be there for the purpose of art, it's also serving other purposes. It's either showing the strength of the state, right? The reason that we're able to fund this art or produce this art or support this art is because we're wealthy, right? Or what that particular individual represents, also showing the strength of the state as well. So there's a lot of, I don't know, is it hidden or not so hidden meaning when we're taking a look at the depictions here. So it is much easier for the state to maintain its authority through ideology, through everyone buying in, right? Because if you think about it, if it's a police force or a military force that is supposed to maintain the order, um, there are very few of them compared to the rest of the members of the state. And if the rest of the members of the state decide, oh, we're not putting up with this anymore, of course, the military, the state gets extremely nervous. So it is because they understand, right? There's way more of the sort of occupants, right, of the state, that foundation of the state, population-wise, than there are those who are going to enforce it. So ruling through ideology and mindset, everyone buying in and maintaining the status quo is, I sound like a politician, don't I? I'm not running for office, I promise. But it is the way that the state is able to, have things running smoothly without having to always, invoke their right to use force. That, makes for a police state. It's extremely uncomfortable for everyone involved. Okay. Um, all right, so we've got some background here about a state. Let's take a look, as we've been doing, at our cultural example. Our cultural example is in a culture that we've been following throughout the semester here, and it's the Aztec state. The Aztec were definitely a state. As I mentioned, when Cortez looks down over the valley of what today is modern day Mexico City, he sees in 1519 a population that's 250,000. And you talk about monumental architecture, you can see it in all of its glory here on this slide. It was meant to impress. There was definitely ideology tied to this. And my goodness, that monumental architecture, right? And so this location here, this is the central city. We're going to see in just a sec here. The next slide is actually going to talk about the location is Tenochtitlan, and we'll see that on the next slide. It's all spelled out for you, not that you have to memorize the spelling or pronounce it for that matter. And what you're looking at here is what's called the Templo Mayor, which is the main temple really in the heart of the city. The entire Aztec city of Tenochtitlan was planned out, very meticulously planned out. And we can see it's at this time it was surrounded by water. Today it's not. Today it's all landfill. And so the the next time you're in Mexico City, which is prone to having a lot of earthquakes, keep that in mind. It's landfill. And I had a bit or a large panic attack. I'm thinking about this when I was riding on the subway in Mexico City. I'm underground and I'm thinking to myself, I know this is all landfill, right? And I know what happened in San Francisco during the 1906 earthquake. And so I'm just thinking to myself, please don't let there be an earthquake. And then, that's the last thing you want to be thinking when you're underground because it's game over at that point. And so we can see you've got massive population sizes, right? So you've got this massive, let me get over here. You've got this massive population density here. You've got the ideology here. Okay. So, of course, not all of the populace is going to be able to ascend the stairs. These are all stairs on their way up to these two temples. The two temples would only be accessed by the priest who is going to be overseeing this. And so they're going to oversee the ceremony. Definitely rulers would be allowed to be in this position. We'll take a look in just a little bit. We'll see some slides on their social stratification. These steps are extremely steep. And so even those individuals that were in these positions of power, by the time they got up these stairs, they were out of breath because this is at a high elevation. They're out of breath. They're climbing all of these stairs. And by the time they get up there to the two temples here, so this is the temple of, sometimes called Quetzalcoatl, the blue one, sometimes called Quetzalcoatl, sometimes called the Temple of Tlac. This has to do with rain and it has to do with fertility. Over here is the temple of Huitzilopochtli. Huitzilopochtli has to do with warfare. Okay, so you've got the blue and the red. You've got the balance, right? The two opposites there. And these are their two main deities. And so as they're going up the stairs here, by the time you can see there's a few individuals up here at the top, by the time they reach the top, they're out of breath, they're bent over. So even these very prestigious individuals with a high ranking are still, kind of cowering down in front of the two main temples belonging to these two kind of dualities and representations in Aztec belief system. And then you've got other administrative buildings here, right? So you think about all of the red tape, all of the bureaucracy, right, and those who are employed to carry out the bureaucracy. So you've got the administrative buildings, you've got the buildings where the Eagle warriors are being trained. They definitely had a standing military for sure. And we see some other examples here of why this is a state. You've got their system of writing, you've got a system of record keeping. And so what would happen is the Aztec, they arrive, their late arrivals to their current location in the 1100s. And they just kind of hang out, and they work for the cultures that are in the positions of power up until the 1300s, and then they start to marry into these prestigious families. They start to, over the past 200 years, the 2 centuries, they've gained some social status. And now, and warfare, military was always a huge part of their culture. And so now they're in this militaristically strong position. And anytime they end up men were expected to spend time in military service. Anytime they end up winning a battle, and they won a lot of battles, there were a few that they didn't, but they won a majority of the battles. The states then that fell to them were subservient, and what they had to do was they were essentially the nation states, and what they had to do is they had to pay tribute to the Aztec, right, as a result of losing the battle. And so they end up paying tribute. And so what you see here are some of the examples of tribute. Something else that was somewhat similar to warfare, it was definitely tied to warfare, was the ball game. And so you can see this is a hard rubber ball made of a rubber tree plant. You had some pads here that were made essentially out of deer hide. If you thought that dodgeball was painful, dodgeball is with a rubber ball that has air in it. Imagine a ball that's a similar size, but it's hard all the way through. Yes, you're like having flashbacks right now. I don't know. Do they still play dodgeball? It was painful. I always ended up getting hit, really hard by the dodgeball. And so, here's an example of a solid ball all the way through. There were broken bones all the time. They would play this ball game, and they actually thought that when you went to war, if you killed those that you were victorious over, they thought that was a waste. They were like, why would you do that when you can take not the bodies, they're not dead yet. They will be though. But you can take these individuals, you can either use them as sacrificial victims, right, which is necessary for the continuation of the world. So that was important. Or you could play against them on the ball court. And what ended up happening then was those that lost were sacrificed. Um, I kind of let it slip there. They eventually become bodies. Yes. And so we can see, here's the mask that's worn, this jaguar mask. I mean, just amazing. You've got a headdress here, right? And you've got this is a representation of a temple. And again, you see those stairs and you see the roof right there, right? Here's the roof right here, and you've got the stairs. So you can definitely see that's a representation of a temple. And making offering to the temple so that you are going to be victorious on the ball court. Here is what their central city looked like. I guess I should say, because it doesn't look that way today. And this is Tenochtitlan, as I was talking about. And you can see it's surrounded by water. So it is protected, right? You think about, some of these medieval castles being surrounded by a moat so that they have protection. And here you've got water all around. As I mentioned, it's at a very high elevation. I believe it's right around 7,000 feet is right around the elevation. So yeah, they'd probably be out of breath by the time they had ascended all of those stairs. Um, there are these causeways here. The causeways are the land bridges, essentially, that come off these locations here so that you can access this Templo Mayor, as I was talking about. So you can go from the lakeshore to that central ceremonial district. So we were looking at a close-up of that, and we were primarily focused on the temples. As you can see, it's quite a bit larger. It's planned out. There are different districts, everything, it's a state. If you're going to keep tabs on everyone and what they're doing, you better have it planned out so that you can keep tabs on everyone. So today, when you go to Mexico City, those of you who have been, or maybe you're planning on going, as you know, all of this is all landfill. And so they filled in the lake. But you still see some of the street names, and they are were the original streets that were these causeways. So it's kind of cool as you're, driving down. There's a lot of traffic, so you'll have plenty of time to just kind of sit down, relax, and sort of look around. I don't recommend driving in Mexico City though if you're unfamiliar with how to drive there. Take a bus. That's what I was in. So take a bus so that you can see the names of these causeways here. And like I said, those are the original street names. So that was kind of interesting to see that when I was there. All right. So as far as social stratification goes, let's take a look at that. So you've got nobility, and within nobility, you've got some ranking here. And so you see, you're going to start first with the rulers. These are supreme rulers of those major political bodies. Of the Aztec Empire, for example, Moctezuma would be his name. That was the one who came in contact with Cortez. They could be nobility rulers who are in charge of cities or towns. Of course, there would be a ranking, right? If you're in charge of the empire, you're up here. A city or a town, you're down there. Okay. Our next group here is going to be the chiefs. And I put quotation marks around here because this isn't a chiefdom. It's the name that's used, but this isn't a chiefdom. So they're chiefs. They're going to control a restricted area. They're going to be, remember that military I mentioned is extremely important. So they're going to have those high military and governmental positions. All right. Then you've got the nobles. And it's stated that the nobles are descendants of rulers and chiefs. Um, Sometimes actual descendants, like biologically speaking descendants, but other times talking about like a myth of origin. Here is where they originated, and that's how you account for where they are today. They are going to occupy governmental, religious, and military positions, obviously lower ranking government and military positions than we see up here with the chiefs. All right. Our next group are going to be the intermediate positions. And these individuals, even though they're in an intermediate position, they still have quite a bit of power, particularly the merchants. So the merchants are going to be organized into guilds, and the guild is going to be, if they're trading in turquoise, that would be one guild. If they are trading in, oh gosh, I don't know, turquoise is definitely one of them. If they are trading in different types of food, maybe gold was also something else that was present in the Aztec culture. So, kind of have the different categories or the items that they're trading in. That's the name of their particular guild. And they are going to then travel these long distances. Remember, the Aztec are really successful in going to war with neighboring communities and sometimes communities that were pretty far away, being successful in that, and then making them pay tribute. So part of this tribute was kind of quote unquote trade. Not like you had the option to not trade with them, but so you were definitely indebted to this trade. But so the merchants would go, right? And they would collect what they were supposed to collect. There would definitely be some trading that was going on, but there was also some tribute that was paid, make no mistake about it. And they would also work as agents of the state, right? They were the eyes and the ears of the state. And so they would go out, and if they heard some like little kind of, I'm not very happy with this, or can you believe this, right? I mean, they were they were spies, agents of the state. You could also refer to them as spies. I think that's a legitimate term to call them. And so they're reporting back then to the powers that be in that central ceremonial district, like, hey, we might have a problem over here, or maybe we need to kind of relax because, we're asking them to produce this, that, or the other, and they've had a lot of droughts. So maybe we kind of need to relax that a little bit because there's, they're getting restless. And so you want to make sure that you don't have some kind of an uprising. All right, so the merchants are going to help you out with that. And then you've got the luxury artisans. And the luxury artisans are going to be different than another group of artisan that we're going to look at. So they are going to do the gold work and the feather work. So they're going to be making these items for those individuals that are above them, right? That are in that ruling class. Some are going to be organized into guilds, and others are going to work for the state. And it depended on their skill set. If the state needed, headdresses that were made out of quetzal feathers, and a luxury artisan did that, they would be kind of pulled out of that guild, and then they would be working for the state. The state's going to get what the state needs for sure. Our next category here are going to be the commoners. And we're going to see we're going to break the commoners up into a couple of categories. So this first slide is just talking about commoners that are free commoners and rural tenants. Okay. Free commoners are going to be organized into districts. Capuli was the Nahuatl, which is the name for the Aztec language, or the Nahuatl term for that, also known as districts. The type of tasks that they're going to do, they're going to be agriculturalists, fishermen. They're going to produce many of the utilitarian crafts. Okay, so utilitarian crafts are going to be different than the luxury artisans that we were just talking about. And then you've got your rural tenants. They're going to be commoners who work on the private lands of nobility. Okay, you noticed though, because you guys are so astute, you noticed here that it says free commoners. All right, because on the next slide, we've got commoners who are slaves. And these individuals are going to provide urban labor for the nobility. They are slaves, but it's a different type of slavery than maybe what you might be familiar with in the United States. The thinking here is that they became slaves because they were captured in warfare. As I mentioned, they thought it was a waste to kill someone. Captured in warfare. They were gambling and they had lost a lot of money and they had debts that they needed to pay. Um, or out of economic necessity because they didn't have enough funds and they needed to pay their debts. It could also be a criminal act, such as theft. They had acquired this status. They acquired it because of something that they did, or if you didn't pay your debt, something that they had failed to do. Their children were not born into slavery, so different than what was happening in the United States. Their children were born free. Okay, so I mentioned that the state rules through ideology, right? And we're talking about a different culture. So, what was their ideology? What was their mindset? And what the Aztec talk about is they talk about, let me let me go back because there's a really good view here. Let's go back here. So we can see surrounding the Aztec are these mountaintops, right? As you can see here, we've got these mountaintops right here surrounding the Aztec. Okay. So they talk about the fact that each individual, as they are traveling through life, they are traveling on the tops of these mountains. And if they look down on either side, it's very, very steep. The idea is that if you do everything that is required of you, if you live a good life, if you follow that path, you won't fall off either side, which is going to be a precipice, which is going to cause you harm. Living a good life allows you to continue your journey until your life's end, right? By following that path, doing what is required of you. For those individuals who were thieves, who became these slaves as a result of something they did, it's because as they were traveling this path, they didn't follow the prescribed path. They decided that they were going to gamble. By the way, becoming drunk was also something that, of course, could be lead to an erosion within the society, within the culture. And so that was also considered coming off of the path, and that could lead to quarreling and fighting. That could lead to, obviously stealing. And so they could also become slaves as well. So you see how the state is ruling through ideology. They don't have to institute like a police force or anything like that if everyone is thinking the same, right? Not that they necessarily have blinders on, but if everyone is thinking the same and they're following that path. The only time an exception was made for intoxication was if you were elderly. So if you had lived to a nice old age, you were allowed to partake in a little bit of that agave that had become fermented, a little pulque, or a version of tequila. So that was allowed. Um, you couldn't do that too often, though. If it became a problem, then it's a problem. But you were allowed every now and then because had already had a nice long life. You were allowed to have a little fun every now and then. Okay. So we've talked about bands, tribes, chiefdoms, and states. You look around the world today, there are states. I mentioned there are no pure bands, tribes, and chiefdoms left in the world. We talk, bands are in hunting and gathering. That's how we've spent a majority of human existence in bands. So the question is, why did state level societies develop? And when you look around the world today, that's pretty much what you're seeing. We talked about the fact that when you are a member of the state, you have surrendered a good part of your autonomy, your ability to do whatever the heck it is you want to do, to the state. Hmm. Two very interesting questions, right? Why did state level societies develop? And pretty much you look around and that's what you see today. Um, and, why did people agree? Why did people agree that, I'm not always going to be responsible for, this, that, and the other. I'm going to allow the state to do this. I'll pay my taxes, right? And I'll allow the state to do this. All right, so what do you all think? What do you all think? Clearly, there are benefits, right? Clearly, there are benefits. And if we were in class right now, I'd see all of your hands going up, right? And you would be telling me what those benefits are. So, definitely food production is one of them, right? We're not thinking every day when we get out of bed, oh my gosh, I wonder how my crops are doing today. I wonder if I'm going to be able to go out and hunt and gather today. Um, and then, kind of sort of the population sizes that expand from there. And we also think about the fact that, okay, let's put it this way. So let's say Canada decides that they are going to invade the United States. Yeah, I picked Canada. It would be a very polite invasion, wouldn't it? Yeah, they'd have the out and about, right? And they would apologize profusely as they were doing it. I mean, except that time, that whole war of 1812, where they burned down the White House. That wasn't a very polite thing. But by today's standards, right? By today's standards, it'd probably be a pretty polite invasion as it was happening, right? Okay, so let's pretend that happens, and suddenly hockey is your national pastime, right? Okay. Um, if that were to happen, are you really thinking to yourself, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to, organize a military force. I'm going to have to make sure, what's our plan of attack essentially going to be? No, you're not. And so you know that you've got some protection from those hostile outside forces, which, yeah, it's Canada, so they're going to be, like I said, polite about it. Okay, so getting to those benefits. So the benefits then of being a member of the state. And these are benefits. So these aren't even really things that you're necessarily thinking about because hopefully you're benefiting from them, right? So the benefits are you have protection from those hostile outside forces. You have an effective means of conflict resolution, right? There could be some mediation perhaps that's going on. If you want to take someone to court, you can take them to court. Okay. And also there is increased food production. So yes, we still have to have the jobs to get the money to be able to get the food, but most of us, although we do live in an agricultural community, most of us, I'll speak for myself. If I was to grow my own food and have to worry about it, I'd be going to bed hungry a lot. Yes, I know. And as a vegetarian, you think I would know how to grow crops? No, 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 I don't. Okay. So let's take a look then. These are, of course, very interesting questions for us in anthropology, as well as not just cultural anthropology, but archaeology as well. And let's take a look at three hypotheses, plural, ending in ES, as you can see up there. Three hypotheses having to do with initial state formation. So in the archaeological record, right, when we're looking at these various different cultures, it's like what led them to giving up their autonomy and becoming members of the state. And our first one, of course, has to do with agriculture. And our first one is the first one that was proposed by V. Gordon Childe way back in 1936. He's going to definitely use the archaeological record, and as he's taking a look at a number of sites that have monumental architecture, he can see that there's been some high population densities. Um, he and in there he can see that a lot of them have transitioned to agriculture, and so he starts to think a little bit more about that, and then he starts to generate his hypothesis based on that. And he says, well, when intensive agriculture creates those food surpluses, it frees up that segment of the population from food production. This is where that comes from, by the way. We've been talking about this when we talked about it when we're talking about agriculture um, and industrialization. It comes from this hypothesis by V. Gordon Childe. You've got new occupations that are created, and you start to see things become more highly organized, more highly regimented, because now you've got to sort of keep tabs on what everyone's doing, and everyone needs to make sure that they're doing their jobs. um, he's looking at this in terms of more of a voluntary state formation. In other words, voluntarily, people kind of decide that this is what they want to do. It also helps to protect some kind of a superstructure. It helps to protect interests as well. So V. Gordon Childe is talking predominantly about agriculture for his hypothesis. Okay. The second one we're going to take a look at is proposed in 1957 by Carl Wittfogel. And Wittfogel talks about there being, it's still tied to agriculture, but his focus is going to be more on irrigation. And so he talks about it as being more this hydraulic nature or having to do with irrigation. And he says, okay, so there were these small scale irrigation farmers, right? And they were limited in what they could produce because, as we know, different environments produce different things, and they're also limited by how much irrigation they're able to bring to their particular fields. So the thinking is, if you merge these communities together, you, yes, surrender your autonomy, but what you are able to do is you are able to sort of combine all of these irrigation canals together to be able to produce more food. In merging those communities, though, there has to be some organization. So there has to be labor, and of course the labor to make sure that you're dredging the canals, that the if you need to dam things up, if you need to take a look at slowing down the water flow or speeding the water flow up. It's actually there's a lot to having the irrigation working properly, especially if you're thinking about it in an archaeological time period. So you have to have the labor to do that. And then if you're doing all of this, you need to protect your merged communities from other communities who might want to come in and take that away from you, right? Other humans see this and they're like, oh, instead of us doing the same thing, let's go ahead and take that from them. Okay. So you have to have the military to be able to do that. His study, he's primarily looking at ancient Egypt, right? So you think about Egypt, you think about the Nile, you think about all of the irrigation that's involved there, sort of, and also the sort of commerce and economics that can happen because you've got watercraft that makes it a lot easier to get from one location to the next. So kind of thinking about merging those communities into a larger one. So that is going to be Wittfogel's. Yeah, definitely, agriculture is playing a part here, but the main part that he's talking about is irrigation, the hydraulic nature of bringing those communities together for the purpose of irrigation. And our third one has to do with warfare. I mean, kind of alluded to that in Wittfogel's, but warfare is the hypothesis that is proposed by Carnero, and he proposes this in 1970. And he says, well, in the case of V. Gordon Childe, where he was talking about agriculture, they agreed that they would do that. He says, if you take a look, though, at some cultures, they didn't necessarily agree that they were going to be ruled by others, right? They didn't voluntarily give that up. It happened on an involuntary basis. They became members of the state because they lost the war, right? Um, Definitely what we were talking about with the Aztec fits Carnero's hypothesis, right? It was warfare. They were a nation state. You lost, you had to pay tribute, right? Wars occur in areas where you've got limited agricultural land for those expanding populations. So they, kind of go, oh, our population is expanding, strength in numbers, we've got the standing military, we're going to go ahead and attack our neighbors, we're going to take that from them, and then they are going to become folded into our state. Those that lost, as you see, then become members of the state. I don't think that there is a particular hypothesis here that stands out as fitting, every single different scenario. I think it depends on the culture that we're looking at, right? Because we can see that these different ones will fit different cultures. So I think each has its own application that will work. All right, so we're going to do a little transition here. We talked about bands, tribes, chiefdoms, and states, and we saw that something that is extremely important is this idea of social control. So, whatever form of political organization we are talking about, bands, tribes, chiefdoms, and states have to have a means of social control. And so, when we were talking about the state, for example, ruling through ideology, that is a means, of course, of social control. And this is really important for the states. Again, they don't have this large, kind of military that's going to be able to keep tabs on what everyone is doing. So states really have to curb their internal conflict. It's very important for them. When you take a look at um, the armed conflicts that have happened since 1945, 85% of them have started in states, and you can think about the list, right, if you're familiar with world politics. And so it is really important that states be able to maintain social control. All right, but we'll talk about it in terms of bands, tribes, chiefdoms, and states. So first thing we're going to take a look at are the social norms. So, as you know, when you go to a different culture, they have different social norms. And then in our own culture, of course, throughout time, different social norms as well. So, social norms are really those normal, proper, expected ways of behaving. It keeps things running smoothly. You're able to predict what other people are going to do. You know what you are supposed to do, right? So, there's no, kind of kinks in the system, so to speak. There's, kind of keeps things running smoothly. Um, okay, every once in a while there's a certain level of deviance, right? Some of us just we're like, I don't want to be normal. Who wants to be normal, right? Okay, I get it. But it depends, right? If you decide that you don't want to follow social norms because you're going to um, I don't know, wear your PJs to work or something like that, right? That's not a huge social norm that you broke. It depends on where you work. Maybe you're like, I'm working in the back, no one sees me, it's all good. I'm not wearing my PJs to work today. By the way, you guys were wondering if that was me. No, I'm not today. Actually dressed up for the occasion, right? Don't get too often to dress up these days. So, that, but if your social norm is that you're going to commit an act of homicide, okay, that is taken that is taken definitely more seriously. So it depends on the social norm and um, how destructive it could be to the smooth running of the culture if you break it. We are going to take a look next at social norms being sanctioned. So there are social norms that have negative sanctions associated with this. And we talked about kind of depending on the punishment for violating the social norms. So those would be negative sanctions. In the case of violating the social norm of not killing someone, there are definitely some negative sanctions associated with that. And I guess if you're not supposed to wear your PJs to work, okay, they might send you home, right? I don't know. Gosh, if you're working in a clothing store, do you get a free outfit out of the deal? I'd wear my PJs all the time. Positive sanctions are going to be rewards for behaving in socially acceptable ways. Maybe you did an outstanding job at work and they decide that you are employee of the month and you get that special parking spot, right? Back when I used to give exams back to students before we had grade sheet and Canvas, I used to have little foil stars. I really miss this, but I'd have little foil stars that I would put on your tests. And I would say to you, good job, right? You did a really good job. And that would be my positive sanction for you. I actually, a funny story here, I ran out of my little foil stars. So I went to Staples and I was buying more. And the gal at the register said, "Oh," she goes, "Are you a teacher?" I'm buying dry erase markers, all of that. I'm like, "Yeah, yeah, I'm a teacher." She goes, "Oh, what grade do you teach?" And I was like, "The 13th and 14th." And she stopped and she looked at me. I teach at Cuesta, and she's like, "Oh." And it's still, she was looking at me like, "Why are you giving college students foil stars?" And here's just a rule that I live by, right? If it worked in kindergarten, it works in college. There you go. There you have it. So she got a big grin on her face for that. She's like, "I want to be one of your students." I'm like, take one of my classes. You might not say that afterwards. All right. So we've got some, just cracking myself up today over here. We've got our social norms that are sanctioned. They're either negative or positive sanctions. Okay. Um, let's take a look then at these social sanctions here. And we're going to see that another way of kind of dividing this information up are the social sanctions can be informal or formal. And so let's take a look first. These are going to be some of my favorites here. But let's take a look first at the informal means of social control. So, informal means of social control. Now, if you live in a band or a tribe, this is probably going to be the only form of social control, right? They're going to be informal means. You don't have the mechanisms in place to have formal means of social control. And when we take a look at those, you'll be like, oh, yeah, I can see why a band or a tribe wouldn't have that. All right, so our first informal means of social control is something called socialization. Um, and I would say it's called socialization more by sociologists. There's definitely overlap here between cultural anthropology and sociology. And so if you've had a class in sociology, you're like, oh, I recognize a lot of those terms. So socialization, which is teaching the young what the norms are, and of course in anthropology we refer to that as enculturation. So you're all very familiar with that at this point in the semester. Basically you teach the young what is acceptable, by a certain age, we get a little bit of leeway, but by the time we are adults, we're not supposed to have temper tantrums. Just no. I mean, we might every now and then, but you're definitely going to get a look, right? You're going to get a look. Speaking of getting a look, let's see what we have next. Ooh. Our next informal means of social control is public opinion. So most people wish to be accepted by other members of society. I say most. I mean, there definitely could be individuals who are like, I don't care. I'm going to go live up in the mountains somewhere in a cave, and I don't want to socialize at all. But most people that are kind of interacting in society most of the time, they want to be accepted. They don't want to be talked about by others. And so, public opinion, if someone isn't doing what they should, maybe someone's gossiping about them, right? Or I guess you could kind of do a flip side, right? If you're gossiping about someone and you shouldn't be, right? You could do the flip side on that for sure. If you fail to do something properly, maybe you're ostracized. Maybe everyone's kind of giving you the cold shoulder, right? They want absolutely nothing to do with you. Rumor is definitely going to keep behavior in check. So if you think about this in terms of bands and tribes, and you think, well, of course that would work there. For it to work, these individuals pretty much kind of have to know everyone else, and it would become a more potent means of social control. All right. Our third informal means of social control is something called ancestor worship. So ancestor worship is going to be our informal means of social control, but you will also hear me mention it as a type of religious tradition, which is, yeah, that's going to be the topic that we discuss next time. So I will bring this up again. But for now, with ancestor worship, you have deceased ancestors, and they're still considered to be members of the descent group. So, for instance, descent group, like, right? You've got like a grandparent who passed away. They are supernatural being when they die, but they can still keep tabs on what you are doing. Could you imagine if your deceased grandparent was watching everything you did? Oh my goodness. So, very potent means of social control here. Proper behavior shows respect. All right. So you're thinking about, well, no one's watching. I'm going to do this, that, and the other. I'm like, but no, my grandparent is watching what I'm doing. So I must make sure that I show respect, right? And I'm probably not going to do that then. Okay. So those would be three informal means of social control. Like I said, in a band or a tribe, it's kind of primarily what you're relying on. Let's take a look at our formal means of social control. Okay, so oftentimes the informal mechanisms aren't enough to control behavior. And definitely, we saw the three that we were looking at, our informal means of social control, are definitely operating in a state, right? We've probably all come into contact with these, maybe not all of them, but depending on your religious tradition, but in some form, especially like the ostracism and the gossip and obviously the process of enculturation. So, in combination with that, in chiefdoms and states, then you will also have these formal means of social control. Violating the norms, as we already talked about, can lead to conflict. That's really bad for states. That's really bad for chiefdoms. It's honestly really bad for any form of political organization. So, societies are going to develop explicit means to address or resolve conflict. After all, that's why you gave up your autonomy when you became a member of the state, which, of course, that decision was made for you centuries ago. Okay. So let us take a look at my all time favorite means of social control. It's a formal means of social control. I really wish we use this in our culture. Here we go. And that is a song duel. Okay. Song duels are found in a number of cultures. We will talk about the song duel, as you see depicted here, as practiced by the Inuit. So, it's a formal means of social control, which means if this occurred in private, you wouldn't have the same outcome, right? This is going to occur in public. Everyone has to weigh in on this. Okay. They're going to appear in public. And as you can see, you've got two individuals here. They are surrounded by members of the culture. And what they're going to do is they're going to take turns insulting each other with extremely abusive songs. I don't blush easily, but I've looked up, I've Googled the abusive songs. And by all means, if you've got some time on your hands and you want to take a look at that, go ahead. Yeah, family members insulting the integrity of family members, in particular moms and sisters. For some reason, they are the ones that are like really part of the abusive songs. Now, I know now you guys are all pausing this and you're Googling. I totally get it. I totally get it. I couldn't show any of the words because I'm like, if anyone takes that out of context, they're going to be like, what's going on in that class? So they are going to praise themselves. They're going to say these super abusive things about their opponent's family members, like making me blush. While they are doing this, they're keeping time with the drum. They state their grievance. I can't believe you did this, that, or the other, right? Because your sister so and your mother so. And then they're going to also call on their spirit helpers to assist them. And it goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Okay. The contestant with the loudest applause or laughter is the winner. Oh, don't you wish that we had this in our culture, right? Instead of having to go to a court, right? You're like, you know what? I just got to practice. Now, most of you at this point, you're like, oh, this sounds like a rap battle. So a rap battle has some things in common. Definitely mothers and sisters can be part of what's being said in a rap battle. But rap battle actually comes from a different origin. It was actually a form of kind of call and recall during slavery. And so, yes, they do sound like they've got some things in common with one another, but it's technically doesn't fall under this definition of a song duel, because there's this other part here that has to do with spirit helpers. There's a spiritual nature to it. Um, so I know I know you were all thinking that. I get that question every single semester about the rap battle. And now the question, who's your favorite rapper? Do I answer who mine is? I really like Tech Nine, I got to admit. Um, he can rhyme anything with anything. I think one of it's like, oh, I don't know. I won't get into it. You guys are like, oh, not Tech Nine. It's really uncool. My teacher likes it. Okay. All right, I'll stop there. And so back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, right? With this. Okay. So you guys are looking at this and you're going, but yeah, is this whole thing really necessary? So another form of conflict resolution in the Inuit is the following. So usually this occurs because remember the study by Ernestine Friedel, where we're taking a look at gender stratification. And even though the Inuit are hunters and gatherers, I had mentioned that there's the greatest differences between men and women in this culture. And this is going to sort of get back to that. Women are thought of as property, and so it was commonplace for a man to steal another man's wife. And if you stole another man's wife, he could kill you for doing that. Then his family can retaliate and kill a member of your family, and then back and forth and back and forth. And it's like where does this end, right? There's like this retaliation back and forth of killing people. In its place, a song duel. So when we talk about cultures, the way that we adapt to our environment, right? This cultural workaround really is more of an adaptive strategy than complete families just murdering one another back and forth, right? Um, so that's where this is in lieu of killing someone. So let's go with the song duel all of the time, right? And I don't know who just said what here, but I think you all agree the expression on this person's face right here. Okay. Someone was declared the winner, right? Yeah, they're like, "Oh, I can't believe you just said that." Okay, so that is the song duel. And now the second and the third one just pale in comparison to the song duel. I know I should have built up. The song duel should have been the third one we talked about, but here we go. So our second formal means of social control is something called a moot. Now, and I know moot, I just said a formal means of social control, and you're like, informal is up there. Well, it's an informal court compared to, spoiler alert, the third one that we're going to take a look at. And so this type of, it is a formal means of social control, the moot, but this informal court is found in many African cultures. And what is going to happen is it's going to involve a number of kin, so a number of family members and a number of friends. And the types of, kind of sort of items that would be on the docket, so to speak, right? Again, I watch my crime shows. Deals with domestic disputes, inheritance, or a non-payment of debts. So those are like some of the categories where one might approach, as we'll see in just a sec here, the leopard skin chief. There's a leopard skin involved. It's not an ironic name there. All right, so this is a moot. And really, the goal here is to maintain community. It's to maintain community. And so what happens is the litigants that are going to be involved will arrive at the leopard skin chief's dwelling. They will all go inside. There will also be family members and friends there. They're kind of the witnesses that they will call on. The leopard skin chief, as you see here, has this awesome looking leopard skin. There you have it. Definitely a chief, so this is found in a chiefdom. The Nuer is the culture, a culture that we have talked about before. So we see this is from the Nuer culture. Remember, cattle were extremely important. All right. And so what happens is the complainant is going to be the individual that speaks first. So they will air what the grievance is, they will talk about it, this, that, and the other, they will give their support. And then what happens is the leopard skin chief will ask the complainant questions. Next, the accused is going to speak, giving his or her case, right, going through. And then the leopard skin chief will talk to the accused. And then they will have, like I said, family members and friends are also there. And so the leopard skin chief will talk to them, interview them. And this will happen. Everyone will be able to have their say. And then guilt is decided. And the guilty party has to give a formal apology. So this isn't like, okay, I admit I did it. And then like where your heart's just not really in it. It's got to be heartfelt, legitimate. And honestly, if the person that they're apologizing to doesn't feel like it's sincere, um, it doesn't count. So, and the emphasis is on healing the community. So everyone, they're at this point not trying to take advantage because the emphasis is on healing the community, and you're going to listen to what the leopard skin chief says. And so, you really want to have a heartfelt apology. And again, if you're talking about a community where yes, it's a chiefdom, so you've got some larger population sizes for sure. But within the villages, you probably know each other more than you would in a state. It's really important that you don't start to develop these kind of rifts in the community that are going to end up tearing the community apart. And so that is how the moot goes. Our third formal means of social control here is a court system. So something that we are very familiar with. Hopefully you haven't spent a whole bunch of time in court, but you watch your true crime shows, your Law and Order, and you know exactly what I'm talking about. So courts and codified law, these are definitely found in states. And as I've already mentioned, right, the state forbids individuals from using force. But the state itself can use force. I mean, there is the death penalty, like the ultimate force, right? There's incarceration, right? You can force someone to be incarcerated. And they do that to either require or prevent their citizens from doing certain things, right? So requires in we're gonna, that if you do A, B, and C, this is going to be the punishment. And hopefully there's prevention that's happening. Although, in some cases, some individuals are, not in their right minds, and some are just not going to listen regardless. And so it doesn't end up preventing them, but then it ends, kind of requires them at that point then, okay, you're going to get incarcerated or there's a death penalty or something like that. As we know, there are officials that are overseeing this. There's, lawyers, judges, different types of courts too, depending on if it's traffic court or family court, or something like that. And so, when I talk about states having more complexity, those are some of the things that I'm talking about. So the written form here, as we see, we already talked about that being an aspect of the state, and this is different than a moot. Because the emphasis here in courts and codified law is on negative sanctions. It is on punishment, right? Um, Whereas with the moot, the emphasis was on healing the community. And so you are taking a look at an ethnography that has to do with kind of, healthcare and the Zapotec court system and sort of how that differs from perhaps what you are familiar with. All right, and then that concludes, perfect, there we go. That concludes our discussion of means of social control, bands, tribes, chiefdoms, and states. Take care, everyone. Thanks for tuning in, like you had a choice. Bye.